Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 11 about public policy. It's Lesson 10 about tax policy. In this lesson, you'll learn about tax increases and the negative incentives they may create. You'll learn about capital flight, and you'll learn about something called the Laffer curve. We learned in a previous lesson that each year the United States government spends more money than it brings in. We call each of these yearly shortfalls the deficit. We also learned that those deficits accumulate over time, leading to an ever-increasing national debt. We also learned that a great deal of that national debt is the result of our huge entitlement programs, in which people receive benefits from the government merely because they fit into some predetermined category. We further learned that because entitlements are increasing, and the debt is increasing, and therefore the interest payments needed to maintain that debt are increasing also, that the United States is headed to an inevitable crisis where there simply isn't enough money coming into the government to stay on top of the debt and the entitlements. So we need to ask ourselves if there's some way out of this problem. For example, can we raise taxes to eliminate these deficits and to pay off the national debt? Well, let's consider that possibility. If we're going to raise taxes, I guess we should next ask, who are we going to raise those taxes on? To get a feel for that, let's look at who's currently paying taxes. What this graph shows you is the population of the United States, the tax-paying population, potentially tax-paying population, I guess I should say, divided into quintiles. In other words, divided into 5 equal pieces. So we have at the bottom of the graph the lowest 20%, then the fourth 20%, the middle 20%, the second 20%, and then the highest 20% of people who pay income taxes. Now, when I say highest, I mean the people who are earning the most money. We have what's called a progressive tax system in the United States, where people who earn more income are charged a higher tax rate. And you can see that with the blue bars that are by each of these categories. Those blue bars represent the tax rate that these groups pay. So you can see that the top 20% pay a tax rate of around, it looks like 15%. While the second 20%, it's around probably 10%. And the middle 20% around 5%. But notice when we get down to the fourth 20%, they're paying essentially zero. And then we get to the lowest 20%, we actually have them getting money back from the government rather than paying money to the government. Effectively, their tax rate is like negative 8% or something like that. And the truth is that about 45% of American households pay no income tax at all. So it's people toward the top of the income brackets that are paying already. Matter of fact, if you look at the top 20%, they're paying nearly 90% of all the income taxes, while the second 20% is paying about 15. Now you say, wait a minute, that adds up to more than 100%. Then we get down to the middle 20% paying about 5. It's because the lower income people actually taking money out of the system that causes those totals to total up to more than 100%. So we have the higher income earners already paying almost all the income taxes. And we can take that top 20% and we can slice off the top 10% and see the top 10% is paying over 70%. And from there we can slice off the top 5% and we can say that they're paying over 60% of the taxes. And then if we slice off the top 1%, we can see that the top 1% of income earners in the United States of America are paying about 40% of the income taxes that our government takes in. Now, the reason to take some moments and look at this chart is that now we can go back to the question I asked right before we turn to it. And that was, if we're going to raise taxes in order to try to get rid of the deficits and pay off the debt, we have to ask ourselves who we're going to make pay those extra taxes. Well, one of the first things we might consider is the people at the lower end of the income brackets here. I mean, they're basically not paying any taxes right now. What if we made them start paying? Well, the problem with that is an old saying: you can't get blood from a stone, which means that if something doesn't have something, you can't get it from them. In this case, the stone that we're trying to squeeze blood out of is the lower end of the people in the lower end of the income scale. And the blood we're trying to get out of them is tax money. If they don't have the money to pay, you're not going to get any money simply by raising their tax rate. They would rather skip out on paying their taxes to buy food or put a roof over their head. So you aren't going to get a whole lot of money even if you did raise the rate on them. They would simply avoid it somehow, even criminally if need be, because they want to feed themselves more than they want to pay the federal government. All right, so while theoretically we could raise the taxes on them and maybe get some, maybe they don't buy that new iPhone and pay their taxes for people toward the higher end of it, but toward the lower end, they have nothing to give. So that's probably not going to work. So what if we raise taxes on the people up at the top? Well, look at that 1%. They're already paying 40% of the taxes, and they're only 1% of the population. Are they going to be happy about being charged more? No, of course they won't be. And that is going to be a problem. So while the people at the bottom simply can't afford to pay more taxes, the people at the top are very much going to not want to pay more taxes. And they have options to avoid doing it. So we have to ask ourselves, if we did raise taxes, particularly let's just take that top 1%, since that's who's often talked about politically. You'll hear that a lot in American politics today, that we should raise taxes on the top 1%. Well, even if we did manage to do that, would that actually raise the amount of tax money that the government brings in? Now, you might, to begin with, intuitively say, well, of course it will raise the money that we bring in. They're rich people, and we're taxing them more. We're going to get more money from them. But there are reasons to wonder whether that would actually be true. Look at this amazing chart. The blue line charts the highest tax rate that was assessed on the wealthy over the past 100 years plus since the income tax was made a part of our government. You may recall from earlier in this course that the income tax was unconstitutional till an amendment was passed in 1913. Once they passed that amendment, we have tried many different tax rates for the top earners in the country. As high as 95% or more we have asked from them. Now think about what that means. What that means is if you're one of the wealthy people and you go out and earn an extra dollar, you have to turn around and give the government 95 cents of it. All right, so we've tried all these various different tax rates during our country's history. Well, what has that done to the revenue that the government is bringing in? That's represented by the red line at the bottom of the graph. And what you can see, quite amazingly, is the amount of income taxes coming into the government stay right around 12% of GDP. In other words, if you take our total income, total production as a country, the GDP, no matter what you set the top tax rate at, only about 12% of that will be coming into the government as revenue, consistently. So what does this tell us then? It tells us that just about no matter where we set the tax rate on the wealthy, we're going to get about the same amount of money in. How can that possibly be? Why wouldn't we get more money if we raise the taxes on them? Well, one of the explanations is that when we raise taxes on the wealthy, it reduces their incentive to even go work and earn more money. Let's think about that extreme example when I said at the point when they had a tax rate for the wealthy above 95%. If you go out and work hard enough to earn an extra dollar, and then the government takes all of it but a nickel, you may look at that nickel and say, that really wasn't worth working for that extra dollar, and thereafter stop working for that extra money. Particularly if you're a wealthy person, you've already got enough where you don't have to go earn more money to meet your basic needs. You may just simply stop working when they raise the taxes on you too much. And then not only do they not get the extra revenue they were planning to get by raising the taxes on you, they don't even get the revenue they were getting on you before, because now you've decided to stop working. Another problem with raising taxes on the wealthy is they have the means simply to leave. An example of this is seen in the picture here, Gerard Depardieu. He's a French actor, one of the most famous French actors. He's an icon in his country. But what happened was the government of France raised the tax rate for the top earners in their country to 75%. And Gerard Depardieu simply said, I'm not going to give that money to the government. They're asking too much of me. So he packed up and he moved to Russia, where the tax rate is a flat tax rate for everybody of about 13%, I think, if I remember correctly. And so people who are wealthy can simply do that. Lower income people may be stuck where they are. They can't afford to move somewhere else. But rich people can leave if the tax rate gets too high. And then again, not only is the government not getting the extra that they were going to try to charge them, they don't even get the tax money that they were getting before because the wealthy person left. So when wealthy people or successful corporations move away from an area because its taxes are too high, we call this capital flight. And this is possibly one of the explanations why, no matter what we set that top tax rate at, we seem to get the same amount of money coming in. So is there any possible solution to this problem? Well, a possible solution can actually be seen in the same graph. Now, this graph revealed that changing the top tax rate isn't going to change much for us. But notice this is being measured in a particular way. The bottom red line shows the total income tax revenue coming in as a percentage of GDP. In other words, no matter what we set the tax rate at, we're probably going to get about 12% of GDP. So if we want to get more revenue, there seems to be only one way to do it. And that is, we will increase our revenues if we increase GDP. In other words, if whatever policy we engage in can help the economy grow, that's how the government will get more money. And then if we can control our spending, possibly, if we get the economy to grow enough, maybe we could start to eliminate those deficits and actually pay off the debt. Well, how are we going to get the economy to grow? Well, if it's true that the only way to increase revenues is growing the economy, perhaps a way to do that is to cut taxes rather than raise them. And in some strange way, cutting taxes, because it can cause the economy to grow, may end up actually increasing the revenues to the national government. Because while the revenues may stay constant as a percentage of GDP, if we can get the GDP to be bigger, then the revenues actually become bigger too. We've actually seen this argument previously in this course when we were talking about fiscal policy. One of the schools of thought about fiscal policy is called supply-side economics, where they believe that the way to stimulate the economy is to cut taxes. The reason they believe this is an economic theory called the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve can be explained by us drawing a diagram here. So let's begin by creating an axis for our diagram that represents revenue. So as we move up the diagram, the amount of money coming into the national government will be higher. And then let's create a horizontal axis that represents the tax rate that the government is charging, from 0 on one side all the way over to 100% on the other. Now think about this for a moment. If the government is charging a 0 tax rate, how much revenue are they going to bring in? Well, 0, obviously. But here's the great insight of the Laffer curve. What if the government charges a 100% tax rate? How much money will they bring in? Well, think about this for a moment. What if you went out and worked hard all week and then you got your paycheck and it said 0 because the government took it all? Would you even bother to go back to work the next week? Well, I would think you wouldn't. And that's what the Laffer curve understands, is that if you put the tax rate up too high, people just simply stop working. And then the government ends up with nothing. So if the government gets nothing at 0 and nothing at 100, then there must be a curve of some sort, where there's somewhere in between that the government actually gets the most money. And that somewhere, we're not sure exactly where it is, we're going to call the revenue maximizing rate. There's some tax rate that you can set where you will get the most money for the government. If you go up beyond that, you're going to get less. If you go below it, you're going to end up getting less. Well, that area above that maximum rate, we can call the prohibitive range. Well, what do we mean by prohibitive range? Well, what we mean is that if you raise if you're raising taxes up, 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 once you hit that point, if you raise them beyond there, it's going to turn out badly. And so you shouldn't do it. You should be prohibited from raising taxes beyond that point because you're actually going to end up with less money. And the reason for that is that additional taxes in this area end up discouraging economic activity. People say, oh man, they're charging me too much in taxes. It just isn't worth working anymore, and they stop. And so that ends up giving the government less money in the end rather than more. So now, let's take this theoretical idea in mind and start thinking about how it might work with what the actual tax rate is in the country. Let's imagine that the current tax rate is at some point like this on the Laffer curve, and that we then cut taxes down to a no lower rate. Notice what happens. By lowering the rate, we are actually then getting more revenue in. So by lowering taxes, we have created additional revenue for the country because we stimulated economic activity, more people are doing stuff, and more taxes are then coming in, even though it's at a lower rate. So we learn from these ideas from the Laffer curve that additional income for the government, additional revenue, can be obtained through tax cuts. It's actually a possibility. That is, if the cuts actually stimulate economic expansion. But that isn't necessarily true. Let's imagine that instead of the current tax rate being somewhere to the right of that revenue maximizing rate, instead they're to the left, and we then cut taxes, we will actually end up with less revenue. This represents a situation where lowering taxes loses money for the government. So tax cuts can also end up reducing revenue if we are outside the prohibitive range when we do it. So what do we learn from the Laffer curve then? What we learn is that it is possible that lowering taxes can end up actually giving the government more money, more revenue, that then could be used to pay off the deficit or even pay off the debt if we could keep spending under control. But we also learn that that isn't necessarily true. For on the wrong side of the curve, cutting taxes will actually reduce revenue. So now I'm sure you're asking, well, which side of the curve are we on? Which side of the curve are we on? Should we lower taxes or not? The truth is we don't know. Economists disagree with them about it, and certainly politicians disagree about it. All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson. What may be wrong with raising taxes to pay debt? Is it that they're too hard to track? Is it that the Democrats always oppose this? Is it that they're impossible to collect? Or is it that it creates a disincentive to earn? The problem with raising taxes to pay off debt is that it creates a disincentive for people to go earn. If you raise their taxes too much, they'll just simply stop working or somehow hide their income, and you're not going to get it anyway. What is capital flight? Is it federal taxes being higher than state taxes? Is it governments need taxes? Is it that people move to avoid paying taxes? Or is it that states raise taxes when the national government lowers taxes? Capital flight refers to the idea that people move to avoid paying taxes. So if you raise taxes too much, the people you're trying to get the money from just leave. What does the Laffer curve show? Does it show that lower taxes may raise revenue? Does it show that more taxes always raise revenue? Does it show that the wealthy always flee taxes? Or does it show that taxes do not impact revenue? What the Laffer curve shows is that lower taxes may, possibly, we don't know for sure, may raise revenue. And at least some politicians argue that it will, and that's one of the reasons they advocate lowering taxes. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 11. It'll be Lesson 11 about social policy.